former president. There's a reason for all this, of course, the Orange Man and his administration. Stephen Miller, who's currently helping sue black farmers on behalf of white farmers, brought them out of the shadows by parroting their talking points that they hear on Fox News from Tucker Carlson, which in turn is magnified via social media by a constellation of QAnon devotees. According to the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, QAnon is using racist propaganda in an apparent attempt to appeal to a wider audience, particularly suburban women. For more, I'm joined by Mia Bloom, who wrote that article. She's a professor at Georgia State University and co-author of Pastels and Pedophiles, Inside the Mind of QAnon. I'm also joined by Malcolm Nance, MSNBC counterterrorism and intelligence analyst. Thank you both for being here. And Mia, I want to start with you because, you know, QAnon, when I first heard about it, because a friend of mine has a family member that's caught up in it, who's somebody who seemed to be a normal sort of professional who sort of burst into this weird ideology. I think I didn't really understand how much of it was based on not just anti-Semitic tropes, but racial tropes. Talk a little bit about that.
I fully expected that QAnon was going to be anti-Semitic because it has elements, you know, a global cabal and talking about George Soros or Janet Yellen. And it also talks about blood drinking, which these are all things that have been, Jews have been accused of for hundreds of years in Europe and through the church. But when we started looking last summer at the Save the Children campaign, and I'm a supporter of Save the Children, the charity.
The real one.
And so I thought, wait a second, all these children are white and all the Save the Children children are not. And so we did a systematic study because I needed data to show that they were using these racist tropes that go to, let's say, the period of Restoration, where there were stereotypes of the black brute who was going to rape the white woman or kidnap the white woman. And so this is like heart and soul of QAnon.
It's and just to be clear, for those of you who are unaware, because you're living your lives and trying not to pay attention to this, QAnon is basically the belief that the world is run by a cabal of pedophiles who kill children and drink their blood. I guess to stay young forever, maybe. Maybe they're also vampires. I'm really not sure. But that the person who's going to unmask this devilish conspiracy is Donald Trump, who can barely read a cue card and couldn't run casinos in Atlantic City. But somehow he's going to break this massive cabal. So that's the theory. You know, in the previous block, Malcolm, I talked about the fact that if this was happening in any other era, we'd be talking about fascism. And people get uncomfortable using the F word here about the sort of global reach of all this. But we just saw these neo-Nazis marching in Philadelphia. And the group, other than Black Lives Matter, which has the word black in it, which freaks people out, I guess, the big opponent of the right is Antifa, which is basically short for anti-fascists. So the people that they despise the most and think are the most dangerous are Black Lives Matter, a plea for black people not to be murdered by police, and anti-fascists. So am I unfair to say that we're talking about essentially American fascism?
No, not at all. Anyone that can, you know, see with their eyes understands what's going on here. We are in a neo-fascist era in American politics. You know, back in 1939, 1940, there was a formal fascist movement which openly supported Adolf Hitler and called for American, independence and, isolation away from Europe's war, which Hitler had just invaded, called the America First movement. It was championed by people like John, Lindbergh, the famous flyer. They had a rally in Madison Square Garden in which George Washington was juxtaposed with Adolf Hitler. These people were fascists. But what we've seen is after World War II, when they were essentially run to the ground, there was a rise in the 1950s and 60s of these very small fascist groups that turned into terrorist groups like the Christian Identity Movement. What we are seeing now is a merger of every white nationalist trope and group and ideology bound together by the crazy QAnon conspiracy theory into a American neo-fascist movement led by a fascist president of the United States. Look, if I were doing an intelligence assessment of, Hungary, I would be coming up with these exact same lines of investigation, which would be bringing us to these conclusions that there is a fascist movement, not just in the United States, all over Europe, which is actually funded, surprisingly, by Russia. In France, Italy, Spain, neo-fascist movements everywhere are out to take down American democracy.
And you know, it's the sort of irony is if you read up on it, I mean, Hitler was inspired both by Mussolini's original fascism, which is where it started, not in Germany, but also by the United States, in which Americans invented the idea of coding anyone with African lineage as Negro and as thus both enslavable and as segregatable, based on even one drop of black blood. Look it up. It's actually true. Mia, the other piece, absolutely. Mia, the other piece that you get to, and I think this is important and scary, I think, in a really fundamental way because of how religious the United States is as a country. How much of this QAnon movement is pushing its way into the evangelical movement and targeting evangelicals to try to recruit them?
Well, that's the scariest part because it's making inroads into every religion, despite the fact that it's anti-Semitic, it's drawing Orthodox Jews, it's anti-Catholic, it's drawing Latinx Catholics, but the largest group are the evangelicals, that around 35% of evangelicals believe that there's a blood drinking cabal. But remember, evangelicals are also a proselytizing religion, and they'll go out to Papua New Guinea or Ghana or wherever they're going, and they're going to bring this ideology with them. And so we are seeing a metastasis of QAnon to 85 different countries. And the reason I wrote the piece about racism is as they are spreading their tentacles to get into South and Latin America or into Africa or among African American voters in this country, I want people to know how racist QAnon really is.
And you know, Malcolm, the thing is, the other piece is that for this kind of a movement to take hold of a political party where the leadership seems just completely impotent to do anything about it, Kevin and those guys, Mitch doesn't want to do anything about it because he's just like, am I going to get power out of this? If I'm going to get power, whatever. But if you want to be fascist, I don't care. But Kevin seems helpless. Meanwhile, there's a poll that the Global Morning Consult did where it found that 26% of Americans qualified as highly right-wing authoritarian. That's twice the share of the number 2 countries, Canada and Australia. 4 in 10 Republicans versus in an American Enterprise Institute, that's a conservative organization, they did a poll that said political violence may be necessary. If elected leaders will not protect America, the public must do it themselves, even if it requires violent actions. Add to that, I want to know how concerned you are, given that data, Malcolm. The guy who runs MyPillow, who's a ridiculous figure, but you can be ridiculous and dangerous. He has said that on August 13th, Donald Trump will return to office. He will be reimposed in office, which is a QAnon belief system. He also claimed there will be many down-ticket senators who will have different election results. They're talking about stealing elections and Trump being returned. How worried should we be about a January 6th style event somewhere in the United States when he is not reinstated, Trump?
I don't think we should really worry about the August date because, as we know, these things are come and go. They've had these dates before. It's the post-August period that I would really be watching as a terrorism professional because, you know, Donnie O'Sullivan, I'll give a shout out to our brothers at CNN, did some interviews with these people, and they said that if Trump is not reinstalled, then they're going to have to start talking civil war. I've been monitoring their communications since last December. These people are already, many of them, committed to the concept of overthrowing American democracy and inciting civil war. All you have to do is watch AR-15 ammunition prices, which skyrocketed last year from 21 cents a bullet to almost $1.25 a bullet now. Many of these people think that there is an apocalypse coming. Let me tie this back into QAnon. I think you were rather modest in what you said QAnon was. They believe that there is a global cabal of people who are eating, kidnapping, and sex trafficking children who are the entire Democratic Party, all liberals, all progressives, and the fundamental way of dealing with them is a mass genocide of all liberals and Democrats, or bringing them to Guantanamo, or having what they call the Day of the Rope, which actually came from the Turner Diaries, the book Timothy McVeigh read at the time. These people are the farthest edge of the farthest extreme, and they are now the core identity of the Republican Party. The Republicans tried to co-opt them in 2018. QAnon co-opted the Republican Party. They just removed the letter Q. They don't allow Q T-shirts. But the belief system of the Republicans now, full on QAnon.
Yeah.